Hey there, it's Chris with Good Roads. Welcome back. The last board project we did here on the channel, I showed you all how to make an easy, inexpensive, low barrier to entry powder surfer. Basically, if you want to cut your teeth on making snowboards, get started and start to see what the ropes are like, that's a really good project to start with. The project we're going to start today, we're going to step up our game and move up the rungs of the ladder of snowboard building. We're going to be making an advanced powder board or an intermediate level snowboard build. It sits somewhere kind of in the middle. Personally, I think you could pretty fairly call it a powder surfer, but we're gonna put binding mounts on this one. There's some purists out there and they make a good case that powder surfing is no bindings. That's the definition of what that kind of board means. So this is gonna be an in-between step. We're gonna be making a bamboo core composite snowboard with a proper top sheet and base material, but we're not going to be profiling the core and we're not going to be adding edges or sidewalls or anything like that. Advanced powder surfer, intermediate snowboard build, whichever way you slice it, we're going to be building a really cool composite board that should be super fun on deep powder. So let's get started. The first thing we need to take a look at is the material for our core. I'm using a sheet of vertically laminated 1/4 inch bamboo. Mine's cut to 54 inches in length, and the first thing that we need to do with that core is establish our center line. So I'm going to be taking a square and dropping my center line down the center of the core. The next step is kind of a combination of things happening at once. I have the template that we've been using for the past couple powder board builds. I've been modifying it to make the different shapes, but that template doesn't have binding placement on it because it's not meant for boards that have bindings. So I also grabbed the snowboard that I've been riding all season where I've got my stance and my binding set up kind of the way that I like them. And I'm going to be combining the geometry from that template and my comfortable stance on my snowboard, trying to figure out where to put my threaded inserts to mount my bindings. And then I'm using a binding insert disc to mark where my threaded inserts are going to go. Now that we know where the inserts need to go, we have to drill recesses and cavities for them. For the inserts, I'm going to be using top hat nuts, and I grabbed a Forstner bit that's the exact size of the flange on the top hat nut that I'm using. I'm going to use that to drill a recess, and then I'm going to drill my holes all the way through that the threaded part of the nut will fit into. Next, we're going to move on to some of our other materials. I'm going to cut my base sheet material to length. This is an UMPI base. This is an ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, which is just a high density plastic. It came from a snowboard material supplier, so it's sanded and flamed on one side so it'll bond to resin well. I'm just going to cut that to the length of the board. The next piece of material I need to address is my top sheet, and for that I got a material that I've been really curious about and interested in using for a long time. This is what's called either a 2-ply veneer or a wood-backed veneer. It's a cherry veneer that has the main grain of the veneer running long way and it's paneled, and then on the other side of it, it has a second veneer running cross grain. That allows the veneer manufacturers to make very large sheets. They're very flexible. They're not going to crack or tear. They're going to stay nice and flat, and you get that additional dimensional stability of the grain going across the fibers of the main wood grain of your veneer. So I've got a lot of hopes for this material in this context and for a lot of other boards in the future, different things I wanted to experiment with it. So I'm really excited to try it and really curious to see how it works out. To cut it out, we're just going to do the same thing we did on the base sheet. I'm going to lay down my core and then use it as a template to cut my top sheet. This is going to be a composite build, so next out we're going to roll out some glass. This is the same biaxial 45-45 20-ounce glass that I've been using for all of my composite builds so far. And just like we did with the other two materials, I'm using the core as a template and I'm just cutting out my sheet to shape. I did that twice, and we have the glass for our layup. Next thing that I needed to address is the top hat nuts that I bought, which were the right thread size. It's M6 is the standard thread size for binding inserts. They were a little too tall, so when I put them in my core, they sat proud. I needed to grind them back down so they'd be the proper height. And to help in doing that, I threaded a bolt in from the backside and then used a nut and a locking washer. That would guarantee that when I went to put the top hat nut up onto my sanding belt, it wouldn't spin and push itself off of the bolt. And that helps me guarantee that I'm gonna get the right height because the nut itself isn't moving back and forth. That's something I learned to be cautious about from experience, so take it from me, make sure that your nut is locked down. Once that was secured tightly in place, I just took it to the grinding belt, knocked it down to the right size. And then after it's the right height, there's one last thing we need to do, which is to make sure that epoxy doesn't get into the threads in the insert. And to do that, I'm just using some clay to fill up the inside of the nut to make sure that it stays clear of epoxy during the build. We can go in later and pick all that clay out and make sure our threads are clear. That's all of our materials taken care of, and now we've got to start prepping for the build. I'm using the same mold set that we made in the video I did on how to make an inexpensive snowboard mold way back. I'll link to that below. It's really easy and fast to do, and the only thing I'm doing here to try to make things work a little bit better is that I am adding some plywood as a baffle, and I'm hoping that that is going to guarantee that my base is going to stay nice and flat. And on top of that plywood, I laid out some plastic, and that's just a mold release. Epoxy doesn't stick to plastic, so that's going to make sure that our layup doesn't stick to our molds. There was another precaution that I wanted to take, which is that mold set has some gaps and unevenness to it, so I wanted to put a kind of squishable layer above the top sheet to make sure that everything was getting pressed down nice and even and that veneer gets bonded to the board really well. A closed cell foam rubber is something that I've seen used for this before, and the cheapest version of that I could find is actually a dirt cheap camping mat that I bought off Amazon. I'll put a link to it below. It was actually the best solution I could find for something that was about the thickness that I wanted, and I didn't have to pay an arm and a leg to get it. So yeah, let's go camping. Because all I need is for that to fit in the mold, I use my mold half as a template to cut that out. That's everything we need to do the layup, so I'm going to start prepping my materials by cleaning the base. I'm going to wipe it down for dust, and then I'm going to use a solvent to make sure that there's absolutely nothing there. This time I'm using alcohol, but acetone works better. I was not comfortable using acetone because it's cold in my shop and I had a fire going. You don't want to be using that around an open flame because the fumes are combustible. So we went with alcohol. After that, I got my space for my layup all organized. I got all my materials laid out in a way that makes it really easy to grab them when I need them, really easy to move between things and shuffle them around, because as soon as we mix our epoxy, we're under a deadline. So once I was sure that everything was where it needed to be and I was ready, I got my protective gear on, got some gloves, mixed up some epoxy, started the layup. And the layup's pretty straightforward. All we want to do is wet out, which means soak, all of the different layers that we're putting down with epoxy, and then lay them on top of each other in the order they need to go in. We're going to start with the base, and then we're going to add our first sheet of fiberglass. We're going to wet that out, and the fiberglass is really helpful for that because you can see it go transparent as it gets wet. After that, we're going to put down our core, but before we add it, we're going to flip it upside down, add some epoxy to the little cavities where our threaded inserts are going to go. We're going to drop our threaded inserts in place, make sure that they're stuck in good. After the binding inserts are in place, we're going to flip the core over. As you're going through, it's really helpful to make sure all the little pieces of your layup are aligned. It's a lot easier to do that while you're laying it up than to try to compensate at the end. Wet it out. After we've got our core flipped, we're going to grab our other sheet of glass cloth. I'm going to lay that down. Wet it out. And then grab our top sheet and put it down on top. That's all of the components of our board in place. We're going to add a couple other pieces into our molds as precaution. That's going to be a second sheet of plastic, again, to make sure that the mold doesn't stick, and our sheet of foam to make sure that everything is nice and smooth and even on the top sheet. Great. All the materials for our board are laid up, wetted out, stacked in the mold. We've got sheets of plywood making sure that we have a nice flat bottom. We've got a sheet of foam making sure that we've got even pressure across the top. Now we need to squeeze the snot out of it, actually squeeze the epoxy out of it, and make sure that all those layers get compressed so when the epoxy cures, it cures as one solid unit. And in this case, I'm just going to do that by clamping spars over the molds and cranking them down as hard as I can get them to go, and adding a lot of weight on the top for distribution of force. And the next step in the process is to wait a day or two. So that's where we're gonna end it for today. In the next video, we're gonna pick up after the epoxy's had time to cure. We're gonna pull the blank out of the mold, clean it up, shape it, sand it, finish it, get it prepped for riding, and test drive. So thanks for sticking along with me on the journey so far. I hope you enjoyed it. And stick around for the next one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment below if you got questions or anything like that. I do try to respond to as many of them as possible. This one's gonna be fun, guys. Stick around for the next video and see how it turns out. I'll see you soon. This is an UMPI base. This is an ultra high molecular polyweight, ultra high molecular polyweight, ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, which is just a high density plastic.